Auto insurance can all seem the same until it comes time to use it. So don't get stuck paying more for less coverage. Switch to USAA Auto Insurance and you could start saving money in no time. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Atlassian. Atlassian makes the team collaboration software that powers enterprise businesses around the world, including over 80% of the Fortune 500. With Atlassian's AI-powered software like Jira, Confluence, and Loom, you'll have more time to do the work that matters. In fact, Atlassian customers experience a 25% reduction in project duration per year. Unleash the potential of your team at Atlassian.com. Atlassian.
Good afternoon, guys, and welcome to the podcast today. And I've got a very special guest for you, Chris Gray. He's got a doctorate in psychology coming out of Chicago, and he helps clients understand buyer psychology, consumer psychology. He's known as the psychologist, and I'm really happy to have him on to discuss mindsets and the psychology around the consumer. A lot of the audience or cohorts are high income, and understanding consumer behavior patterns and how to avoid sabotaging your finances is of utmost importance. Chris is the man. So Chris, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's good to be with you.
Yeah. Briefly introduce yourself, and I'm excited to dive into the questions.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Yes, I'm a consumer psychologist. I've been doing this for about 30 years, have a lot of experience behind me. I started out as a psychologist and quickly realized I didn't love being a therapist, and kind of looked around for some different options and ended up landing in the business world, particularly within sales and marketing. And I have really focused on doing a deep dive into how consumers think, how they make decisions, how they shop, and really understanding what it is that motivates and drives people to make those decisions. And so I work with typically high-performing professionals who are really looking for an edge in a crowded marketplace by understanding and empathizing with their targets.
So we'll dive right into it. And so consumer psychology myths, and what are some common myths in consumer psychology that undermine the effectiveness of sales strategies, and how can businesses overcome them?
Sure. I think it's one of the things that I focus on quite a bit, because my purpose really is to elevate psychology in the business world and making it a force of good. So my tagline is influence customer behavior without feeling gross. And that's really where I hone in. And that requires me to do a few things. And one is education. Another is myth busting, because when we are not operating from a mental map that is accurate, then it really opens us up to biases and mistakes that can be really costly. And so I like to really take on some common myths that you might hear a lot about, you hear floating around, and they sound credible. But once you dive in and dig into them, you realize that's not really true. I think one that I've tackled that's been really interesting, because it really is clickbait that sounds fantastic. But there's this myth that consumers have shorter attention spans than goldfish. And there's always this quote, people are quoting a Microsoft study that apparently or allegedly said that consumers' attention spans are less than 8 seconds, while goldfish has an attention span of 8 seconds. Once I started digging into that, what I realized is there really was no such study that studied this or had these findings. There was a Microsoft study, and you can click on the link, but it takes you to a study that really doesn't talk about goldfish at all or anything like that. And what I found was that no one's actually ever studied the attention spans of goldfish. And the reason that's important, and I think it's important to understand what gets attention, how attention works, because again, if you're in a crowded marketplace, often the first or the most effective one to get attention and keep attention is going to have a big advantage over competitors. It's really having an accurate idea of human attention and how it works and what its shortcomings may be is really important. And so when we look at how attention works, there's really two avenues for getting attention. And one way we think about often is disruption. And we hear about that quite a bit, especially when we think about digital marketing or this sort of thing. We have to create disruption and get people's attention. And disruption can be a very good short-term strategy. Disruption really just means something stands out against its background or its environment. That's why school buses are bright yellow. That's why ambulances have sirens, so that we notice them right away, right? The challenge with disruption is that it only works for an instant, because what kicks in as soon as something grabs our attention, the very next thing that our brains are asking us, often automatically without us even thinking about it, is this relevant to me? Does this matter to me? And if our brains automatically say, then we move on to something else. And so it may have gotten our attention for a second, but that's really all it did. So if you think about, I live in Chicago, I know you're in Houston, you probably hear as often as I do, car alarms going off at night. How often do you run to your window to look and see, oh, is this something I need to worry about? No, our brains go, okay, there's another car alarm, and we go back to sleep. And that's, if we're only relying on disruption, then let me get that for a second. And that leads us to the second way of getting attention, which is actually much more powerful, which is relevance itself. When something's relevant to us, when we feel like something is meaningful, if it matters to us, then it's not only going to get our attention, but we'll be able to maintain our attention. Classic example from your Psych 101 class is called the cocktail effect. And basically imagine yourself at a cocktail party and there's all kinds of ambient noise around you, many conversations, people laughing and having fun, there's music, but you're having a conversation with a friend. And because you're concentrating on a conversation, all that ambient noise fades to the background, right? But if someone in a conversation next to you suddenly says your name, it's like, what? It's able to break through what's called selective attention to grab our attention because our names are very relevant to us. And so there's a lot of power in relevance because not only will it get your attention, but then if your brain again is going to kick in and say, is this really meaningful to me? And if it says yes, then you're much more likely to maintain that attention. And so when we talk about the goldfish, I think what's happening here is that it is true that attention has become more challenging, both from a consumer perspective and from a business or marketer perspective. But the reason for that is not because our attentions have suddenly shrunk. It's because there's more and more vying for our attention at a given moment. And that may seem a little bit semantic, but when it comes to how to attract and engage your consumer, we have to remember they are capable of paying attention. If you've ever binged a show on Netflix, like probably most of us have, it can maintain your attention for quite some time if it's interesting. And so what I think it does is it puts the onus on us to say, you know what? Yes, attention is harder to get, but it's not because it's not possible. It's because we just have to work a little harder to be relevant, to be disruptive, and to engage that consumer in a way that's going to be really meaningful to them. And that's where things like insights come in and consumer research, which I've been a consumer researcher for 30 years. That's why that is so important, because the more we know about someone, the more likely we are to not only attract their attention, but then to engage them, compel them, and motivate them to act on it.
Ready to launch a career and future you can be proud of? Welcome to Merrill, where an industry-leading advisor training program will help you get licensed. And with lead gen support from Bank of America's vast customer base, you'll get the referrals you need to establish your own practice. It's time to see your career charge forward with Merrill. Apply now at careers.bankofamerica.com. Copyright 2024 Bank of America Corporation.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Interesting. Yeah, it's like attention, especially in today's, it's a crowded attention is a very valuable currency. I think Gary Vee, he wrote a book about using attention, the currency of attention to build traction. Very interesting. For example, buyer psychology, I always love to relate it to the audience. And buyer psychology and a lot of, you talk about coercion and tricks and and what are some red flags or things like coercive, high pressure selling that the audience needs to be aware of so they don't get tricked into high interest products or products they don't need or just wasting their money on these courses. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think that it's one of my sort of core principles is to, again, if I'm elevating psychology for good, then I have to look at the flip side, which is when is psychology misused? And there are a lot of amateur psychologists out there who are more than happy to tell you about psychology tricks you can use to trick your consumer into buying something. And it's actually a question I get a lot when I tell someone that I'm a consumer psychologist is like, oh, so you trick people into buying stuff they don't need. And my reaction, I used to hate that question, but now I love it because my reaction is, look, you can do that. You can. Like marketers these days we have the tools, we are sophisticated enough, we've got everything at our fingertips to get anyone, just about anyone, to buy just about anything once, right? But that is not a sustainable business model because if someone feels tricked into buying something, think about your own experience. We've all been in a situation where, like you said, a course or whatever, and we're like, oh, it's great. And then we buy it and then we're let down, right? A, you're probably never going to buy from that place again, whether that's online or in store, wherever that may be. And two, when we feel like we've been coerced, the very first reaction, and then if it continues, it becomes frustration, anger, resentment, and then ultimately avoidance. And if that is the reaction people are having to your brand or product or service, then you've got a whole lot of trouble ahead of you because you're just going to now have to keep suckering people, new people, into buying your product. Meanwhile, the people that did buy it and angry. And so I always think about this more long-term. You want to make customers happy because you want to develop relationships with them. And if you think about the greatest brands on earth, that's what they've done. I'm a big Apple fan and almost all of my electronics are Apple, but that is because I have what I like to call a resilient relationship with Apple. And Apple has really created and maintained a resilient relationship with its customers. And resilient relationships, what really makes them special is that they are often two-way. So they're listening and innovating along the way. They are looking out for your best interest, or you feel like they're looking out for your best interest, and they're long-term. And most importantly, they are resilient. And so if a brand that you have a resilient relationship with makes a mistake, we all make mistakes. Every brand has made a mistake. Our first reaction is, I'm going to go buy the competitor. Our first reaction is, oh, they screwed up this time, but I trust them to get it right. I trust that the next time they're going to get it right. And I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And that is a much more sustainable model to be successful over time. And it's really important to me. Like I said, it's one of my core principles is like, I don't engage in tricks. I don't engage in coercion. What I try to help my clients do is find wins for themselves, but also for their customers. And that's very possible if you have the right mindset.
Yeah, interesting. And especially if somebody feels tricked or duped, that's in healthcare, that's your higher risk of getting sued for those types of behaviors and actions.
That's really not sustainable, right?
Yeah.
The red flag that you mentioned this, I think some of the red flags is that when someone uses terms like psychology tricks or psychology hacks, that's really a red flag to look out for because like I said, I think everyone feels like they know a little bit about psychology, but this is literally one of those situations where a little bit of information can be dangerous. And it can really lead to some costly missteps if you're a business person.
Yeah. Moving on, you talk about is coercion, empathy. A lot of a really good quote that I heard is they buy based on emotions and then they rationalize it later with logic. Describe the roles that emotions play in consumer decision making, especially like fear or greed, and how can businesses use engagement to drive sales without being manipulative or being coercive or aggressive? Talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's very astute of you to bring up the idea that we buy based on emotion, we rationalize afterwards, and that's often very true. In fact, most of the things that we buy, nearly everything we buy, there's an emotional side of that decision. And rational thought is important. We want to make smart decisions, but we have emotional reactions for a reason. Emotions are evoked much more quickly than rational thought. It is something that comes from when we were cave people, we had to assess a danger very quickly. And that's part of how our emotional responses have developed. They happen in this flash. In fact, research has shown that they happen within milliseconds versus rational thinking, which takes a little bit more time to kick in. And one of the things in thinking about from a sales standpoint is people are going to have emotional reactions. It is absolutely a given. And so what I always say to my clients is, if that's a given, the only question then is how strategic are you going to be about what emotions you are eliciting from your clients and what you want your brand to be associated with. I've got a 7-step process that I work with my clients, and it really is about how to influence behavior in a way that is effective, in a way that you can feel good about, because not only does it create wins for you, it creates wins for your customers. And again, getting to those win relationships that are resilient. And you mentioned fear. I think that's a really important one because we hear a lot about evoking fear in customers, and that's a great way to motivate them. And while it is true that fear can be a very powerful motivator, it's also a very blunt tool. And when we evoke fear, that kicks into some very primal responses from people, fight or flight, right? And so while that can get someone's attention very quickly and it can motivate them, how that gets translated into behavior or a decision can vary widely. And so if you're planning to use fear, you have to have a strategy and a plan for how do you resolve that fear for them. Because it's really, I always say, it's not necessarily the fear that motivates people, it's the search for security and safety once that fear is evoked. And we think about, there's some very common industries that use fear quite a bit, like insurance companies, right? Or tire company, Goodyear, or that sort of thing. And it's really just a reminder of, hey, something bad can happen, make sure you have the right tires, right? And I think in those cases, it makes sense. I think a lot of times, again, this comes back to relying on false information or just a little information when you probably need more. Fear can really backfire. I know one thing that kind of gets evoked a lot is scarcity, right? So there's only so many left, so you better act now. Then in a way, that's evoking a fear of missing out. But I think consumers are onto this now. Like every time I go to buy something, it's, there's only one left. It's, okay, sure. Everything that I click on says that. And so I think you have to be very careful because that can then evoke people not believing you, being skeptical of your claims, and that can translate across your brand and create skepticism for your brand in general. And that's a problem.
Regarding impulse buying, how does one as a consumer start to identify like their emotions are gearing up and how to program their rational mind to override those emotions? It's very similar to like situations like road rage or argument or gets out of hand, these types of things. How do you apply your tools and techniques to prevent impulse buying?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't necessarily prevent it per se, but I want it to work for people. We've all been in a situation where we go to a store, plan to buy milk, and we come back with $100 of whatever. And yeah, I've certainly been. And the funny thing is, I know all this stuff and I still fall for it sometimes. But if you make an impulse buy and it's actually something that works for you, that's not necessarily a bad situation. If you want to buy yourself a treat or you want to, I don't know, find a pair of shoes that you love, whatever. If it works out for you, that's not necessarily bad. But it's those impulse buys that we regret later or that are detrimental to our budget or relationships or what have you. That's when it's really a problem. And so one of the things when I talk about it from a consumer standpoint is in psychology, we like to use a term called metacognition. What that really is self-awareness, right? So metacognition is being able to think about how you think and how you make decisions. And so the more self-aware we can be, first of all, take the shame out of it, because we all respond to things emotionally. We all have made impulse purchases that we regret. And so it's not a matter of shaming people. It's a matter of saying, let's take a step back. Just think for a moment about what it is we're doing. And does it fit with what we want? Does it fit with our aspirations? Does it fit with our dreams for the future? And if we can say yes, then hey, fantastic. But if we say no, then the next step is, how do I want to respond to this then? Is this what I really want to do? And so sometimes it's not the sexiest answer, but it is something I truly believe in, is being able to develop that sense of awareness. And it really sometimes is just a count to three. You see something you just gotta have, take 3 seconds and just ask yourself, does this fit with my goals in life? Does it fit with what I want to achieve right now? And so being able, and that is something that you can develop. It's like a muscle, being able to take that 3 seconds. And so what happens, it typically is, if you can practice that, then the 3 seconds becomes automatic, or it becomes longer. You're able to take 5 seconds, and you're able to really let that rational thought kick in. And once that emotion is really gotcha, and that is a really great way to let rational thought take over.
Interesting. Final question before we call it a day is, what's interesting is my encounters with sales and marketing is that they're very aggressive and pushy. And, a lot of times, like, you want to talk to them and they're talking at you, so how can sales and marketing professionals shift from thinking about their customers to thinking like them? I think the best sales and best marketing professionals, they actually sit there and listen. They don't try and wrestle the conversation. I always feel like they're trying to wrestle the conversation and trying to push an agenda. And I'm not sure if they learned that, they teach you that in school or something, but it's very off-putting.
Yeah, it is. And again, I think we've all been in a situation before where it's just uncomfortable, where someone's really pushing a sale. And even if you were interested in that item, you start getting that resistance, right? Whoa, this does not feel right. And he's very pushy. I don't know. And I think the thing is too, like with the sales and marketers that I typically work, nobody wants to be that guy or that woman. No one wants to be that person. But I think that there's sometimes when people have pressure, if they've got certain goals they have to achieve, sales goals and that sort of thing, that can take over and they can get aggressive. But when I work with sales and marketing teams, what I say is, look, the best approach you can take is to develop your empathy for that customer, right? And what that means is, like you said, like being able to think like them, not just about them, but what is it that they're looking for? What are their aspirations? What are their goals that I can help them achieve? And when you take that mindset, that can be really powerful. I've also been many times in situations where there've been salespeople who are just fantastic. It's almost like they're reading my mind, because they've honed that skill of being able to elicit from you, what is it you're looking for? What is it that you really want? And not only listen to what they say, but how they say it, what's underneath that, to help people verbalize their aspiration. And when you understand someone's aspirations, I have a term I like to use called the aspiration gap, because we all have aspirations, and then we all have aspirations where we're not quite living up to that aspiration, right? And the aspiration gap is where we want to be versus where we are. And as a salesperson, if you can find a way to help them bridge that gap, that is very powerful. And people will not only feel comfortable with you and want to buy from you, but they'll walk away from that sale feeling good about the transaction, feeling good about what they just purchased, and knowing that they have someone looking out for them. And that, again, where those kind of resilient relationships start to develop, because now if I go back there, who am I going to talk to? I want to go to the person that really helped me achieve my aspiration. And the power of empathy is really huge. Sometimes empathy gets a bad rap because it gets conflated with sympathy. And there are actually two very different things. Sympathy is feeling for someone. I'm so sorry you're upset. Having empathy for someone is feeling with them, understanding things from their perspective. Wow, that must be really hard for you. And so when you're able to get into that empathetic mindset, you're actually setting aside your own perspectives. You're setting aside your own biases, And you're listening from a place of, I want to understand what you're experiencing and what you want in life. And that is a very powerful place to come from as a salesperson.
Yeah. How can people find you and follow you and reach out to you and check out the great work that you're doing?
Excellent. Thank you for that. Yes. So you can check out my website. It's thebicologist.com. And I'm actually going to be starting a newsletter in a few weeks. So it hasn't kicked off just yet, but if you go to my website, you'll be able to get some information about it. And if you're someone who is curious about human behavior, you're looking for an edge in a crowded marketplace, and do so in a way that you can feel good about, I'm going to be providing tips. I'm going to be providing inspiration, research, the latest psychology news, so that you can do that. So that's one. You can look me up on LinkedIn. My name is Dr. Chris on LinkedIn. That's my handle. And other than that, I would just say thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I love that. And thanks so much for coming on and sharing your expertise, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much.